So let's talk about life cycle of a component. So prior to this video, we have discussed on how to make a component and also how the component can be used, as well as how a child component can communicate with the parent and vice versa. So if you haven't watched that video already, I'll highly recommend that you should go and watch that video so that this video starts to make a lot more sense. So without wasting any time, let's get started. So I have already discussed that what are the life cycles, right? So just like the way we humans have a life cycle, that we take birth, then we live the life, we go through the changes, and then the human dies, right? Sadly, but that's what the life is, right? Similarly, components also have similar life cycles, right? So in order to see that thing, let's create a component first, and we'll create a directory called as src, and then inside src we'll have a directory called as component, and we'll create a component called as timer.tsx. So now what we are gonna do is we are gonna create a component called as timer, and what we want, the moment that timer component gets created, we want to start a timer. And by starting timer, I simply mean that we are just going to show the count. It will start from 0 and it will keep incrementing in an interval of 1 second, right? So how can we do that? Let's first create the component timer, and we need a state to show the count. So we'll create a state called as useState count, and it will be initialized with the value 0, right? So let's just render the count, and let's call this component in our app component, right? So as you can see that 0 is here. Let me also increase the font size so that it's visible. I'll say 40. I'll also give margin of 40. I'll give a color of black. Okay, we can see that 0 is getting rendered on our screen, right? Now what we want is the moment this timer component gets created in our app component, that is whenever this timer component takes birth, we want to start the timer, right? So how can we do that? We can do that by implementing a concept called as componentDidMount. So what does mount means? Mount means getting attached, right? So whenever this timer component gets attached to app component, we want to start the timer, right? And how can we do that? We have a hook called as useEffect. So let's use useEffect. Now if you hover over useEffect, it will show that it expects a callback function as the first argument, which you can see here, right? And the second argument it expects is a dependency array, right? So that's what I have done here. useEffect is written, the first argument is a callback function, the second argument is the dependency array. Now what this useEffect does is that it will ensure that whenever this component gets created, the callback function immediately gets executed. The body of the callback function will immediately get executed, right? We will also talk about what this dependency array is, but right now let's just keep this as an empty array, right? So if I say console.log timer got mounted, we can see that timer got mounted. The reason it happened is that we placed timer in our app component, and we have written a useEffect, and inside the useEffect callback function we have added a log statement. And as the way useEffect works is that whenever the component gets mounted, it will immediately execute the callback function. And since we have console.log timer got mounted, that's why we are able to see timer got mounted, right? But this is not the action which we want to perform whenever the timer component gets mounted, or if you want to say whenever the timer component gets created. What we want to do is we want to start the timer, right? And in an interval of 1 second, we want to increment the count, right? If we increment the count in an interval of 1 second, by 1 you will see 0, 1, 2, 3 and so on. So how can we do that, right? So the way we are going to do is we are going to use something called a set interval. Set interval expects two arguments. First is the callback function, second is the time interval, right? So I have written 1000 and it expects time interval in milliseconds, as you can see ms, and 1000 millisecond is nothing but 1 second, right? Now again coming back to the set interval. Now what this set interval is going to do is that it will execute the callback function's body in every 1 second, right? So for every 1 second it will execute the callback function's body, right? So basically in an interval of 1 second this will be called, right? And what do we want to do every 1 second is we want to increment the value of count, right? And as discussed earlier, that if your new state depends on the previous state, then we should use the callback approach to set the state, right? Because we need the previous state, right? So what we'll say is pref count and we'll return plus plus pref count. And if I save this, you can immediately see that the timer has started and it is incrementing our count state every 1 second, right? So what we have just achieved is something called as componentDidMount, right? Whenever the component mounts, this useEffects callback will be executed, and in the callback of useEffect we have a set interval, and that set interval we have defined in such a way that every 1000 millisecond, that is every 1 millisecond, the callback of set interval will be called, and in the callback of set interval we have the setter function where we are taking the previous count and we are returning an incremented version of that. Hence we are achieving a simple timer, right? So this is how we implement componentDidMount, right? Now the question here is, why do we want to do this thing, right? So in our example we are using a simple timer component, but consider it this way, that you are working on a food delivery application and you have just created a home screen, right? And that home screen is again a component, right? Now the moment that home screen gets mounted, gets attached, right, you want to make a network request to your backend server and fetch the list of all the restaurants available right now, and you want to render that, right? So basically you want to do something when component gets mounted, and the way you're going to do is you're going to write useEffect and you're going to pass two things to useEffect. First is the callback function, second is a dependency array, and whatever is present inside the callback function, that will get executed the moment component gets mounted, right? So this is how one of the lifecycle method, that is componentDidMount, works and is implemented in React and React Native. Thanks.